Yes, no sound yet. I think we'll start. There are still some folks drifting in, but we should move ahead. Um, Want to welcome everybody on behalf of the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University, and on behalf of the Sustainable Energy Initiative at the faculty. My name is Mark Winfield, and I'm a professor with the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York. And I'm also co-chair of the Sustainable Energy Initiative. I also run the Master of Environmental Studies program, the Master's of Environmental Studies Juris Doctor program at the faculty. As with all events at York University, we begin with a land acknowledgement, and this acknowledgement is of course specific to the location of the university, and we invite people to reflect on their own locations and the history in terms of how it is they came to occupy those lands over time. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University's campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and we also note that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And indeed, this acknowledgement is of some relevance to our topic today, which will be focused on distributed energy resources. And although out of the scope of today's discussion, which is relatively focused on these types of things in an urban and settler community context, it is important to note that First Nations communities are actually very significant sites of innovation around distributed resources and around things like microgrids. I'm co-author of a book on sustainable energy transitions in Canada, which is forthcoming with UBC Press. And in there, we've got what we think is an excellent chapter with contributors from the Yukon and Nunavut around initiatives that are taking place in Inuit and Dene communities in those territories. And this is something we will focus on more down the road. Today's focus is on distributed energy resources, and specifically the study that was completed last fall by Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors and Power Advisory on the potential contributions of distributed energy resources in Ontario. And this study has been regarded as groundbreaking for a number of reasons. So far as anyone I've talked to can tell, this is the first serious attempt in Canada to assess the potential contributions of distributed energy resources. And this encompasses a range of different things: rooftop solar installations, fleets of parked electric vehicles that have been networked together, a range of different possibilities. But this appears to be the first serious attempt to assess the potential contributions to decarbonization and electrification from these resources in Canada. And this occurs at a very timely moment as the federal government is talking in terms of net zero electricity systems. The province is now in a very significant conversation around the future direction of its own electricity system. So this seemed to be a very, very timely topic to touch on. And we have with us today two of the lead authors of this study, Ahmed Hanafi, who is with Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. He's actually director of energy practice there, and he advises utilities, governments, and other actors across Canada and the US on critical technology, policy, and strategy issues related to the clean energy transition. We also have with us Sarah Simmons, who is the Director for Utilities and Innovation with Power Advisory. And Sarah is an electricity sector professional with over 14 years experience in the electricity sector, and she's based in Toronto. She's worked with utility scale and distributed generators, electricity distributors and transmitters, system operators, industrial load customers, and emerging technology providers. So before we move into, so our plan for today is that we will have Ahmed and Sarah do a bit of a presentation on the key findings for the study that was done for the IESO, and perhaps share some thoughts as well on where we're at in Ontario in the DER conversation. We'll then move into a question and answer phase. We are doing this in a meeting mode rather than a webinar mode so that people can ask their questions directly. Our experience has been this is somewhat more interactive, but then I do have to remind people of the etiquette around this, that we need to keep microphones off to avoid extraneous noise, that we hold any questions until Sarah and Ahmed have finished their presentation. I will ask people to then use the raised hand function in Zoom to ask questions. This also helps to keep things in order in terms of who's raised their hands first. I know from experience, we often end up with a great deal of activity in the chat in these sorts of sessions, and that's great. I will do what I can to monitor what's happening there. If there are sort of obvious questions that we may want to bring into the discussion, but it's best to use the raised hand function if you want to ask a question. As I say, there's usually quite a bit of traffic in the chat, so just pulling questions out of that sometimes can be a challenge. Often very just interesting traffic in the chat. But sometimes hard to discern the commentary from the questions. If you do ask questions, given we've got a fairly large group today, I will ask people to be very clear and concise in terms of their questions, as opposed to any sort of lengthy statements, in fairness to other people who may want to ask questions as well. So from there, I'm going to invite Sarah and Ahmed to do their presentation. I think we've got the screen sharing working properly, and they can unmute, and we will go from there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for being here. We just thought we'd do a quick introduction to our respective organizations as well before we jump into the session. So as Mark mentioned, I'm with Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. We're an energy advisory that's exclusively focused on helping our clients accelerate the clean energy transition. So we're 50 people strong, been around for nearly 20 years, and we help our clients with a mix of strategic support and analytical and research support across 4 key sectors of our economy: buildings, mobility, industry, and energy. And we've, very lucky to work with governments, utilities, corporations, nonprofits from coast to coast to coast across the country, as well as south of the border as well, on many issues, including several similar studies on DER potential in the US. I'll pass it on to Sarah.
Thanks, everybody. Really pleased to be here today. Power Advisory is a management consulting firm. We specialize in the electricity sector. We have offices in Toronto and employees in Calgary and Boston as well. We also do work across the country and into the US, particularly in the New England and New York areas. We're a pretty diverse team in terms of energy economists, financial analysts, policy experts, we have power system engineers. And as Mark mentioned, we have a really wide range of clients, from government agencies and regulators, all the way through to a lot of the large scale generators, as well as many of the associations in Canada as well. We specialize in the electricity market, including the wholesale market, regulatory and policy environment. And our contribution to this project was really focusing in with our Ontario expertise with respect to the forecasting of avoided costs, as well as our understanding of how the Ontario market works in terms of the wholesale market and other sort of barriers that may present themselves to DER adoption in Ontario. So it's my privilege to work with Ahmed on this project, and looking forward to our discussion today.
Great. So as Mark said, we're going to take about 20-25 minutes just to walk through a short presentation, and hoping to spend most of our time together this afternoon in more of a discussion and Q&A period. But for the purpose of the presentation, we wanted to touch about 3 things. First is why the ERs? So, why are we all here talking about this resource? And we have some thoughts there to share. And then we'll dive into talking about what the ERs can do for Ontario specifically based on the findings of the study. And then Sarah will share some of the progress and ongoing efforts that we've been seeing in the province, unfold in the province on towards enabling the ERs in Ontario. But starting with why the ERs, I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about the ERs as this new foreign innovation, but really it's been enabled and driven largely by 3 decades of experience that utilities across the globe really have had with efficiency and demand response and curtailment programs, which is really what's enabled us to talk about distributed energy resources as this significant resource class that's emerging today. We've also had significant technology decline, cost declines rather, that have allowed us to put rooftops on solar, put solar on our rooftops rather, install smart thermostats in our homes, and deploy smart appliances in our homes as well. Tandem to that, we've had significant increase in our visibility and control capabilities. So we now know how to control these assets that are distributed across our whole grid, how to monitor them, and how to make sure that they're performing as we intend them to perform. Along with that, we've had shifting market and regulatory frameworks that are enabling the ERs, most notably in the US, FERC Order 2222, which has been a wholesale change in how the ERs are integrated into markets. And we also have a ton of climate action and emission reduction strategies on the federal, provincial, state, and local levels, which put the ERs as quite a big piece of their plans, whether it's in the form of energy efficiency or distributed renewables, storage, and other technologies. And what's great about this, emerging resource class is that it's a great fit for emerging grid needs and issues that we're trying to address. Most notably, there's 3 issues that we think the ERs are a great solution for. The first is after decades of nearly flat load growth in the electricity sector, we're now experiencing or expecting to experience significant load growth from electrification of buildings, transportation, and industry. And DERs there offer themselves as a pretty unique solution that can contribute to resource adequacy and to mitigating peak impacts in quite short order, and in many cases fairly cost effectively compared to the counterfactual of building new generation. We also have aging transmission and distribution infrastructure, as well as growing pressures on those infrastructure. And there, DERs offer an opportunity to avoid or defer infrastructure upgrades through what folks call in the industry non-wire solutions or non-wire alternatives. And last but not least, we have a growing penetration of intermittent renewable generation. And DERs there can play another important role in terms of balancing the grid, avoiding curtailment, and really maximizing the value of intermittent renewables that we're starting to introduce on our grid. So I'll just say, we have this emerging resource class, and it's a perfect match for 3 key problems that we're trying to address as an industry or as a sector. And that's really the core of the study and what we want to talk about today. But we just wanted to give some of that context first before diving into the weeds on the study. I'll pass it on to Sarah for some more kind of Ontario in-depth discussion before we get to the study itself.
Sure, just echoing what Ahmed said here, Ontario has had a lot of experience in DERs already. I would say, taking off primarily with the, in a big way with the feed-in tariff program, but even before that, we had net metering and we had the RESOP program as well, which delivered a substantial amount of renewables in Ontario through those programs, which much of which were focused on the distribution side. But on top of that, what I would call contracted DERs, Ontario has continued to see an increase in net metered solar, as well as behind the meter storage, as well as demand response. And in particular, that has been supporting customers with bill mitigation efforts, for example, the ICI program. And just to support what Ahmed said, Ontario is a very active DER market with a lot of experienced providers. So not surprising to see the results of the study as well, but a really great base to jump off from in terms of experience, not only with the providers, but as well as the experience of the utilities and the growing pains that were experienced, I think, in the early days of the FIT program, for example, when there was a substantial sort of growth happening all at once in Ontario. Good to go next. Yeah. One more thing to point out is that, since our study, we have seen updated information from the ISO in terms of their forecast. So our study is the most up-to-date information at the time, but ISO has a regular process of updating their outlook. So the darker blue line here represents the new forecasted Ontario baseline demand, or like the reference case, for example. And you see a very significant increase in needs reflecting electrification and economic growth. But in addition to that, the ISO is also, they were also tasked last year in publishing the Pathway to Decarbonization report. And effectively, this report now reflects the high demand case where the ISO starts to integrate anticipated demand growth from achieving a net zero economy and moving towards much more electrification as well. So these are sort of the two new bookends that going forward we'll be looking at, but they don't, they're pretty much aligned with the information that we had at the time. I do feel like it's a constant improvement in terms of looking at forecasting, but doesn't substantially change any of the results that we would present today. Oh, yeah. And again, to further elaborate here, with that growing demand, and in Ontario, we're sort of facing two pinch points. One is growing demand, but the other is potential for asset retirement of existing resources. And this graph shows baseline demand growth, so it doesn't show the net zero or pathways to decarbonization impacts. So just under baseline conditions, you can see that Ontario does have a substantial need for new capacity in the next 10 years. And that need grows under two scenarios. One is we're not recontracting existing assets, and a whole bunch of reasons why resources might not be recontracted. But also, if demand is higher and more aligned with the net zero pathways to decarbonization, the needs are even greater. So this is something that obviously ISO is updating regularly, and there's a bunch of procurement initiatives underway. But again, this is information that is fairly consistent to what we were dealing with at the time of our report and its preparation.
Great. So jumping into the study itself, if I had to summarize the scope of the study in one line, it would be this slide, which is, what can DERs do for Ontario? Before jumping into the results, I just want to give a bit of context on the study itself. So the study was conducted over the period between August 21 and September 2022. The material is all public and publicly shared on the ISO's website. So we're going to walk through, some of the highlights today, but for any, DER nerds out there, there's more than 300 pages of content that you could dig into. A couple of folks on the call here, I'm sure, have already done that. But really, the study was commissioned by the ISO as a key input into their DER roadmap and market enablement activities. And there was a couple of key objectives that we had here for this day. The first is to identify what the volume and types of DERs that are likely to emerge in Ontario over the next 10 years are, so the ISO can plan to tap into that potential and leverage that for meeting the system needs that Sarah talked about. The second is we considered quite an exhaustive list of DERs. So looking at behind the meter, things like rooftop solar and storage, front of the meter deployments, as well as demand response measures, both for mature and emerging technologies, things like things that have been around for a couple of years, like smart thermostats, as well as some emerging technologies like vehicle to grid and other things of that sort. One of the things that sets the study apart that I think is quite unique is we looked at the contributions to a wide range of system needs. So most DR potential studies try to quantify energy or capacity needs, or contributions rather, In this study, we actually looked at generation capacity, energy, ancillary services, as well as distribution and transmission needs that DERs can contribute to. So really, it allows us to take a very comprehensive look at the contributions and value that DERs bring to the system. And we also looked at a variety of market policy and technology pathways to understand what DER potential would look like in the province based on different snapshots of what the future could look like. So our base case was what we call the business as usual. So that's something that reflects the market conditions today, as well as the ISO's historical, most recent time planning outlook 2021, which, as Sarah mentioned, has been updated since then. Our BAU plus is kind of the expected market outlook and system outlook in line with some of the ISO DER roadmap initiatives, as well as some of the general policy, market, and technology advancements that we're seeing emerge. And then the accelerated scenario was an attempt to look at what would accelerated efforts to support the transition to net zero, coupled with increased efforts by the ISO and stakeholders to integrate DERs, result in from a market potential perspective. The study itself is kind of focused around three key fundamental methodological phases. The first is identifying what's the technical potential for DERs. So, how much DER capacity theoretically exists out there in Ontario. The second layer is economic potential. So how much of that theoretically possible is actually cost effective when we're considering the benefits these DERs bring to the system relative to their costs. And the key word here is from a system perspective. And the third layer is what's achievable. So what's actually likely to come up on the ground, considering the market participation rules by the ISO, market dynamics, market barriers, and the fact that consumers are not rational. There's decision making that goes into adopting these technologies and whatnot. One quirk of the Ontario market that I think is important to highlight here in the study that or in the approach that we leverage is achievable. What's achievable isn't always a subset of what's economic, in the sense that, to Sarah's point, Ontario has some retail programs or retail facing programs, as well as non-market constructs for DERs like ICI and things like that, which are enabling DERs. So when we looked at achievable potential, we looked at a broader sense of achievable. What would customer economics drive, even if some of these may not be purely cost effective or economic from a system perspective today. So again, there's a ton of results to unpack here, and we're not gonna probably spend 3 hours walking through the outcomes of the study, but for the purpose of this webinar, we wanted to focus on some of the key headlines that we'd like folks in the room here to take home with them. The first is on the economic potential, and just before I show the results here, I want to again make sure the metric is clearly explained. So economic potential reflects the portion of DERs that are cost effective and technically capable of meeting system needs. Cost effective from a system perspective, not from a customer perspective. We also assume that DERs can contribute to any value stream and capture any value stream that they are technically eligible for, regardless of market participation rules or constraints. And we don't consider market barriers like adoption and market participation and all that stuff. So this is really a purely economic look at what's feasible from Ontario. And so just to benchmark the results here, the lines, that dotted lines you see on the right here are kind of analogous with what Sarah put earlier for Ontario's emerging capacity needs. So the deficits that ISO would be looking to fill under each of our scenarios over the next 10 years or so. And what we found is that there is sufficient technically feasible and cost-effective DER potential to meet Ontario's emerging needs for winter and summer capacity. And so what that means is there is, again, technically feasible and cost-effective from a system perspective capacity that can theoretically meet the entire, needs of Ontario's energy system. One question that we get asked quite often is why there's capacity that exceeds the, like why do you need capacity above the needs per se, and why some of those bars are crossing those dashed lines. And the answer is because we're again looking at the study holistically. We were looking at needs for capacity, for energy, for transmission, for ancillary services. So what you're looking at here is a snapshot of capacity reduction by DERs. But in some cases there is excess contributions available because these DERs are being pulled in for energy or for other needs. But again, to put it in context, so 4.1 gigawatts of technically feasible and cost-effective potential for DERs in the BAU, all the way up to 18 gigawatts in the accelerated scenario. So that's, again, pretty significant. We're talking about something in the order of half the system under the accelerated scenario is technically feasible and cost-effective potential for DERs. This is the theoretical layer. We then move on to the achievable layer, which is what's actually going to materialize on the ground. And so, of those system needs that we identified, what we actually see is under current market rules, under current market conditions, about a third of that is achievable. So, from a summer perspective, the ISO has an estimated need under our BAU of 3.4 gigawatt gap, and we believe that there is sufficient achievable potential for DERs that can contribute to 1.3 gigawatts of capacity reductions. So that's about 4 to 5% of the system peak, and about a third of that delta between what's committed and or between the market demand and resources available to the ISO today. Our three scenarios reflected various changes to market policy and technology conditions, but one of the things that we focused on is what are the levers that the ISO can control to tap further into that potential and tap into more of the economic potential. So we looked at expansion to market participation. We looked at barrier reduction opportunities. We looked at access to additional value streams like transmission distribution values through NWA type arrangements. And what we found is that those modeled market changes on the accelerated scenario can significantly increase the achievable potential roughly by threefolds. So as opposed to the 1.3 gigawatts that we're seeing in summer reductions in the BAU, we're seeing up to 4.3 gigawatts in summer peak reductions under the accelerated scenario, which is quite considerable. We're talking about 9 to 14% reduction in system peak under those scenarios. One thing to note here is you'll notice that the bars are consistently, or the bars of what's achievable are consistently higher for summer than winter, in the sense that we have identified more or higher contributions for DERs in the summer than in the winter. There's a couple of things there to note. The first is a big part of the potential we identified was solar, rooftop solar, which in the winter does not really contribute to capacity given timing of Ontario's peak event. We also see a considerable drop in potential from HVAC and AC driven opportunities, which obviously don't exist in the winter. And given the relatively low penetration of electric heating in Ontario's electricity system, or energy system rather, these opportunities are not met with their counterparts of heating controls in the winter. We also see a lower coincidence for some measures with Ontario's peak. So whereas in the summer peak, some of these technologies and DERs are able to contribute fully. In the winter, there is less of a coincidence between when those capacity requirements are from a system perspective and when the contributions of those DERs are. So all this to say that we've identified that the potential for DER contributions in the winter is fairly lower than that in the summer, which is not a surprising result, given that there's a significant portion of that comes from solar. The third kind of interesting insight from the study here is that 4.3 gigawatts or that 1.3 gigawatts in the BAU is not a single measure. It's a lot of different technologies and rooftop solar and whatnot. But when we actually dig into the results deeper, we find that 6 key opportunity areas represent 70% of the achievable potential. So specifically, the top areas that we've identified as having high potential in Ontario across all three scenarios really are residential AC thermostats, so air conditioning thermostats and controls. This is a relatively untapped potential opportunity in Ontario that there's been some attempts to pull that into the market, but fairly limited up until recent activities being conducted and considered by the ISO. There's quite a lot of potential in analogous to that in the large commercial segment. So folks that are used to participating in ICI and have had already installed controls and been able to manage and control their loads. That's another low-hanging fruit for potential and quite a significant area, up to 280 megawatts in the accelerated scenario. We also see general commercial load flexibility and industrial load flexibility playing a big role. But the more interesting thing here especially on the rightmost scenario and accelerated, is we see these 2 emerging areas or 3 emerging areas that were previously, just not there because the technology was not there. The first is smart EV charging. So, with the prevalence of electric vehicle and increasing adoption of electric vehicles in Ontario, both on the passenger and the commercial fleet side, we're seeing significant opportunities for passenger EV smart charging in particular, so about 213 megawatts of that. And we're also seeing significant potential for vehicle to grid or vehicle to building, which is two-way controls, if you will, where the battery in the vehicle not just is something we can throttle down to reduce charging, but we can also withdraw power from the car and from the battery to inject back into the grid. So it becomes essentially a battery on wheels. And so we're seeing about close to a gigawatt of potential contributions from V2G by 2032 under this accelerated scenario, which is quite a considerable and quite a surprising result for us as well. V2G is a relatively nascent technology, and we're seeing some of the contributions start to emerge by mid-decade, but really by 2032, we're starting to see this technology come to prime time and offer significant reductions or significant capacity contributions rather. And then there's about 1.4 gigawatts of additional measures that come from wide array of measures and segments of Ontario's energy system. But really wanted to highlight this to say that there's a diversity of DER potential, DER measures in the province, and significant potential across multiple segments. But really, we see that the concentration of potential is going to be in HVAC, which is typically one of the biggest end uses for energy, as well as in those emerging applications for EV smart charging. The third one that I also just wanted to highlight is behind the meter storage. So I'm actually just realizing that I quoted the wrong numbers. So V2G is 724. I apologize. The 955 that's actually the non-residential behind the meter storage. So we're seeing considerable growth in behind the meter storage as the economics of storage goes down by just driven by technology improvements, as well as more customers are able to tap into market revenue potential from capacity, from energy, from ancillary services, which really sweetens the deal and results in fairly cost-effective and favorable conditions for battery storage adoption. Again, I just want to highlight here, solar PV is doesn't show up on this graph for a couple of reasons. So we actually found considerable solar PV potential. I believe it was up to 25 gigawatts of installed capacity. When we actually look at the capacity contributions of those resources to summer peak, it is quite less than that, given the coincidence between solar and winter and summer peaks. And then the winter it's near zero, or actually I think it is fully zero, just given the no coincidence between solar generation and winter capacity needs in Ontario. So there's a lot of information to digest, and I think I'm sure folks have specific questions about individual pieces. We wanted to keep it at the fairly high level for the purpose of the presentation, but in the Q&A, I'd be happy to dive into specific areas and unpack some of those messages further for folks in the room.
All right, I'll go on the next slides here. So I'm just going to provide a bit of an update in terms of, transitioning from the recommendations within the report, but then also talking about what we're seeing since the report has been published, and also provide our opinion in terms of, where we could potentially be looking next. So in terms of the finding, you can go to the next slide, Ahmed. Is it there? Here we go. So based on our findings, we had some primary recommendations, as well as some further considerations for the ISO and other decision makers. So in terms of the primary recommendations were all focused on enabling DERs, and the top line there is ISO should continue with some of its very important projects that are already underway in terms of the DER market vision and design project that was started before our study commenced, and is looking at a path that is similar to some of the FERC order 2222, which speaks to removing barriers for DER market participation. So this includes things like providing for aggregation, potentially lowering the threshold for market participants, all in aid of enabling those resources better access to revenues from the wholesale market and enabling those resources to sort of participate and provide that kind of competition as well. But the other thing we recommended was that, those changes take time. ISO has a lot of things on the go as well in terms of, market renewal and a number of other, important procurements and things like that. So one of the major areas that we also recommended as part of the results here was that the ISO should pursue specific initiatives that target high potential DERs that are cost effective in the near term. So rather than waiting for all the new tools to be developed by the ISO, that takes time, market rules that take time, the ISO should implement and coordinate with the industry on measures that enable participation through things like programs and targeted procurements that don't necessarily require market participation. The other area was that of our sort of primary recommendations was developing a T&D protocol or T&D coordination, as well as compensation framework. So there's quite a bit of value associated with non-wires benefits. And we need to make sure that there's a clear framework for compensation of these resources for these benefits. And that goes to capabilities and procurements that utilities might be able to offer. So in terms of the high priority areas as and the high impact areas that Ahmed was speaking to, residential demand response, ideal potential for a program that could be enabled either by the ISO or could be LDC led, or could be implemented through things like rates, like critical peak pricing or direct load control, those types of programs that we've seen in the past. With EVs, we do think that it's and sort of smart charging type programs could be implemented again, either ISO led or LDC led, and also through things similarly to residential DR, through things like dynamic rates, critical peak pricing to sort of promote shifting of consumption. In the longer term, we think it's appropriate for the ISO to start studying and piloting V2G and V2B with how those technologies could work either through programs or participation. And then, in the long term as well, storage and solar, given their high TRC and economic potential, the study did recommend potentially targeted procurement to enable either front of the meter or behind the meter solar and storage uptake. One thing that's interesting, just to kind of point out from Ahmed's summary and sort of the where solar kind of came into play. So capacity is low, but energy is potentially high, and Ontario is shifting now. It's thinking in the longer term, a lot of the focus had been on capacity, but we're shifting to a period where not only will we need capacity, but we're going to need energy to back that up too. So the energy has increasing value as well as we're electrifying and needing more energy, not just the capacity. And then I'll just kind of have a couple more comments on the other slide there. So in terms of the sort of longer terms or sort of further considerations, we did recommend that the ISO consider broader coordination with OEB and LDCs to continue to support some policy discussion and to continue to engage in sort of demonstration projects. And in terms of, I'm going to cough. I'm sorry. I'm just going to mute for a second. Just got a tickle. Ooh, sorry about that, everybody. In terms of integrating DERs, One thing that we found that was kind of a challenge with the study was actually data. And that was an area that we recommended as well in terms of more coordinated data collection on DERs that are in the market to help inform plans and potential procurements. So for example, ISO has a lot of data on the things that they've contracted, but we really have to hunt for the information to get visibility into other DERs that were not contracted in the market, and that will continue going forward as well. So those were the main kind of areas of the recommendations. So now I'm ready, Ahmed, to go to the next slide. Okay, in terms of action, so we laid out what our recommendations were. We were really pleased to see almost immediately the minister issued a directive to expand CDM and also include a targeted residential demand response program. So you can see directly where that came from. I see, you know, that being directly tied to some of the recommendations from our report. In terms of the DER market vision and design project, the ISO is moving forward. They have a foundational model as well as a enhanced model, and the foundational model really has a focus on those high priority areas that were identified in the potential study. So that includes things like aggregation for C&I customers, and then the enhanced model also recognizes the potential for aggregation of residential consumers. Further, we saw a ministerial directive to the OEB. So the OEB is directed to consider removing barriers for CDM programs and non-wires programs, as well as supporting the removal of barriers for EV charging deployment. And then finally, with another OEB initiative was the framework for energy innovation that came to a conclusion with a final report just recently. And there the OEB underscored that there's an expectation for distributors to move forward with modified planning and operations to prepare for DERs, as well as an emphasis on using DERs for non-wires. And they're at the end of this month, they're providing guidance to the LDCs on things like compensation frameworks and incentives for them to use in their rate applications. And the OEB is also developing a benefit cost analysis framework that will consider benefits beyond just the distribution system and consider the whole system. So I view our report, you know, obviously it was developed kind of in parallel with this, but definitely supportive of that initiative and consistent with the findings of that final FEI report. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of the next steps and next things we're keeping our eye on, the electrification and energy transition panel is working away very hard, and you know it's our hope that the work that we did on the DER potential study will be foundational data to inform that in terms of broader uptake for you know, system benefits of DERs and the roles that DERs can play. So hopefully that's foundational. The ISO is moving forward with its procurement initiatives, and we do think that there's an opportunity there to look beyond just the large scale procurements to think about DERs as well, just given the high potentially through RFPs, but as we've been discussing, other types of programs that could be outside of market participation. So thinking creatively about how to actually procure those resources that you have that are cost effective and have a lot of value for the system. And then thinking about the LDCs in terms of, you know, could they be leading programs and procurements, you know, non-wires or other types of programs where there could be broader benefits associated with DERs, where LDCs can provide, you know, similar to how they've done it in the past with CDM programs, but broadening their potential opportunity for program deployment and enabling customer uptake. So these are sort of areas that we're kind of keeping an eye on right now in terms of next steps, but I already see a lot of progress since the date we've published the report in terms of action on some of those recommendations. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Ahmed.
And I'll turn it back over to Mark, because I think this was the end of our
There you go.
presentation. So,
Pass
yeah,
the
we'll hand
baton.
it back to you, Mark.
No, I want to thank you. This is very, very interesting, and it's prompts a whole bunch of questions. I've got a few, but also want to open the floor as well and ask people to use their raise hand function. That is under the reaction icon or under the more icon if you're in Zoom land. And we'll go from there. I'll hold my questions too, but again, just a reminder of the protocols is to keep your mics off unless you're asking the question, and also to keep your questions as sort of concise and clear as you can, because we've actually got quite a large group, and I'm anticipating we'll have quite a few questions. So I'll hold mine because we've got people who've got their hands up already. So we'll go with Adam first, and I'm just going to unmute you. There you go. So we're good to go.
Great, thanks. Awesome presentation. Keep my question concise. How can municipalities in Ontario play a role in accelerating progress in those 6 areas of distributed energy resources?
I'm happy to start that, and maybe I'll pass on to you, Sarah. I think, municipalities are first and foremost, energy consumers. So these are technologies that municipalities would adopt in their buildings and their fleets and their operations. So one of the we do quite a lot of work for municipalities to help them with community energy plans and things like that. And one of the areas that's often overlooked is integrating new loads effectively and making sure that municipalities are tapping into those opportunities and DERs and potentially getting revenue from market participation and other areas as an end consumer of energy. That's to me the first and foremost area that municipalities can contribute in. I think beyond that, municipalities also have a role to play in enabling DERs and supporting DERs directly and indirectly. So we've seen, not so much in Ontario, but in other parts of the country and the US, municipalities offering things like incentives for solar and for storage and for EV charging and things like that. So that's indirectly enabling communities to tap into that DER world, as well as indirectly through some of the red tape reduction opportunities and permitting and things like that. So those are the 2 or 3 areas that come to mind directly on municipalities' role in DERs more broadly. I don't know if Sarah, you have any other thoughts to chime in?
Yeah, I think municipalities have a very big role, and incremental. Like, I definitely agree with what Ahmed said, but even practically speaking in Ontario, and looking at the amount of procurement that's going to be going on in Ontario, municipalities have a role directly in terms of approval and support for projects that are being procured. But beyond that too, if you look at regional planning, that is an activity that is done to look at the needs of in an area from a power system perspective, but what are the regional needs, and the ISO has a sort of a process to go kind of around the province in those in those local areas. And one of the first steps that they need to do is scoping and assessment in terms of what's happening with demand growth, what are the opportunities there. And I think one way that municipalities can help is like helping to kind of scope those studies in terms of what is the potential for DERs to contribute, and are we accounting for all the sort of resources that are available and non-wire solutions as well, and really kind of putting those on the table and promoting it that way.
I mean, the question around the role of municipalities, of course, begs the question around where do the LDCs
Right.
fit into this as well, because they're clearly very direct
Many
relationships with
programs,
municipalities, and so
yeah.
where do we envision their role in all of this? We've known some of the LDCs have actually been sort of chomping at the bit a bit around DERs, and how do we see that part of the conversation unfolding?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the clients that I work with is Toronto Hydro, and the city of Toronto mandated Toronto Hydro to develop a climate action plan. And, to the credit, Toronto Hydro has done that. And it's all about how do they enable solar and storage and EVs. So, the LDCs are definitely required at the table here in terms of how are they removing barriers and planning for DERs in the future. And I do appreciate as well, a lot of the clients that I'm working with are interested in evaluating non-wires solutions and are actually moving forward with those types of initiatives as well. So I think it's slowly but surely working through the regulatory process, but we're seeing quite a bit of progress. Ahmed?
Yeah, just I mean, I echo everything Sarah said, but just to maybe add a little bit more to it, I think I see LDCs and their role in DERs as probably the key enabler of tapping into all this potential. Where we often talk about it in Ontario as a foreign concept, but if we just look south of the border, a lot of the distribution utilities in Northeast US and across the entire US, do operate programs and are able to communicate with their system operators and extract value from DERs as non-wire alternatives, while customers extract their own benefits for retail benefits, while upstream benefits from generation and energy are also tapped into. So there are examples that we can look at. It's there are obviously regulatory hurdles and interoperability issues to figure out, but it's not a foreign concept. It's actually the reason a lot of DERs are showing up in the US is because utilities are able to be at the forefront, offer their customers who they own the relationship with these opportunities, and tie them into the energy service, as opposed to DERs just being this additional thing that a customer has to worry about and tap into. So yeah, really see it the role of LDCs as I don't believe in silver bullets, but if I did, I'd say that's the silver bullet that could enable DERs in a significant way in Ontario.
Thank you. We've got a number of questions now. I think Terry Young is next in the line.
Thanks very much. Great report. I think this has got some really good stuff in here from my former colleagues at the ISO. And Mark, thanks for doing this. I think it's really timely. I've been doing some work in this space for the past year. When I look at the report and I see the 4,300 megawatts, do you get any sense of where we need to be by when in order to get there? So when I look at, some of and I agree, Sarah, I think there's been some good stuff, but like where we have to be at 28 or 30 or 30, to get to that point in 32. Did you look at that, or do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, so we did look at and first of all, thanks Terry for your really great feedback. We did look at every single year out to 2032. We just, for the purpose of simplifying reporting, we did look at 2032 as our, anchor year. But, the reality is, yeah, a lot of these technologies ramp up over time steadily. So, if we don't start today, we're not going to have that 4.3 gigawatts in 2032, because we do need to build the know-how. We need the industry to build up capacity and to how to tap into these resources. We need the ISO to be able to coordinate and operate these resources. So we need to start now to get to the 4.3. There are a couple of technologies where we do see the ramp up happen a little bit later in the decade. Again, in particular things like V2G. But again, that's not to say that we don't have anything to do right now. The ISO has already done quite a few pilots on V2G, and there's probably more to be done there to fully understand this technology and give planners and operators the comfort level with being able to rely on these resources as a great asset. So yeah, beyond the trajectories that we identify from a purely cost perspective, I think a lot of the paving the way for this potential to materialize has to happen now in terms of gaining experience, ramping up industry capacity, and just things take time. Launching programs, launching procurements. These are not things that happen overnight. They do take quite a lot of planning and activities.
Would the sense be that we're behind relative to some of the US jurisdictions in terms of figuring out what sort of regulatory framework you need and compensation structures for some of this potential to be realized?
My view is yes and no. I think the way I view the ER procurements is that there's four key options here. We have procurements through markets. This is an area where everyone's kind of on the same playing field. FERC 2222 is driving system operators to get there, and we're seeing some good progress happen, and will continue to happen over the next year from the market's perspective. Second option is through targeted procurement mechanisms for the ERs, and I think in Ontario we have one of the most innovative pilots that I've ever seen through the York Region NWA pilot, which is a very exciting opportunity to leverage market mechanisms to procure NWAs. So that's I think an area where Ontario is ahead of the curve. There's also rates, and that's an area where you could see Ontario is perhaps a little bit behind. A lot of jurisdictions have menus of rates that customers can opt into. I mean, obviously Ontario's had TOU for quite some time, but there's other rate options that can enable the ERs, whether it's things like VEDAR type tariffs like we're seeing in New York and New Hampshire, whether it's critical peak pricing, just rates as an option. Let's say Ontario is perhaps a little bit more behind there. Where Ontario is also maybe a little bit behind the pack is on programs. So as I said, as Sarah alluded to, LDC and utility programs have been critical to tap into some of those hard to get through market segments, like residential customers, the many small DERs that collectively make up a huge portion of the potential that are just hard to get through markets. Those are best, often extracted through programs. And unfortunately, well, again, now we're seeing signs of progress on programs, but it hasn't been an area of priority for the IESO up until this most recent residential DER program announcement. I don't know if Sarah has additional thoughts to say there.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are seeing progress. Like so Toronto, just because they're top of mind because they're client and I'm working on some other projects, but Toronto Hydro has a local demand response program that they are running this year, and they would have plans to continue that, right? And I'm sure that Hydro One, I'm sure that some of the other utilities, Electra was mentioned here, have run programs to support as non-wire solutions. So we're getting there. It's definitely not as advanced. I think it would, in some of these other markets where it has been a little bit more advanced, it's been more of a mandate for utilities to go out. Like, so in New York, there's, the reforming, the vision, right? So, maybe that's the kind of the next push that might be needed in Ontario to kind of get that moving. But, we do see the OEB working very hard. We do see the IESO working very hard on integrating DERs, and LDCs are advancing. And I think the pace is only going to pick up from here.
Good, thank you. Next we have Joseph Good.
Thank you, Mark, Sarah, and Ahmed for your work on DERs. This is a very current and relevant field. Obviously, your presentation outlines the market supporting things like solar for residential rooftops. I've constantly had a vision to get solar and wind technology into the hands of homeowners. And I think I share this common vision of smaller communities powering themselves. I know Ahmed mentioned that there has been a reduction in prices for solar and wind, and Sarah mentioned a shift in the markets in our favor. Could you comment on how the economics is shifting to enable getting this technology into the hands of homeowners, specifically from a small business perspective, selling technology in single home solar and wind systems?
Do you want me to take that first?
Sure, yeah, please.
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time in the course of my career with the what was formerly the Canadian Solar Industry Association, and is now it's all together with the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. And the residential sector has always been challenging just in terms of scale. But really, I think like the key thing is like targeted programs and things like that that sort of enable customer uptake. I think that utilities potentially could have a big role in that area there in terms of, you know, helping connect customers to vendors and you know, making you know, generally available you know, information about solar and uptake. So it's hard. I think, you know, there was a big push obviously through the feed-in tariff program, a really major incentive that drove a lot of development at the time. But you know, there needs to be kind of like more like information available, potentially like incentives and financing mechanisms available for customers to adopt solar. So yeah, it's just, I think we know what the right tools are. It's just a matter of getting those implemented again.
Yeah, I agree with everything Sarah said. I view incentives as not something a tool that creates new demand, but as a tool that pulls demand forward. And so, you know, with the microfit days when, you know, there was very lucrative contracts on the table, a lot of the demand that would have naturally happened now was pulled forward by, you know, a couple of years. And then when we had the transition from microfit to net metering, and we saw this bit of a lull period where just the economics did not make sense for people who would be willing to adopt at those prices, right? And I feel like now it is changing a little bit. Again, it's very challenging to Sarah's point, but the economics are looking a bit better because of the technology cost declines, because of net metering, because of the federal program. So we have now, you know, the on the residential side, the Greener Homes program, which offers $5,000 for homes. We have a soon to be finalized, hopefully, investment tax credit for 30% that would offer residential and non-residential solar systems, you know, financial support. So, you know, I think there are federal policy outlooks that might make the market jumpstart the market again. But yeah, today, like in the absence of those, you know, the market has died down quite significantly just because, you know, demand from my perspective, demand that would have naturally happened now was pulled forward as a result of those microfit contracts and all that. So this lull period now is, you know, is hopefully coming to an end with some of the federal policy changes or directions that we're seeing.
Good, thank you. Next we have Nick Chiazzo.
Hi, I do a lot of work in the development space. So we actually work between developers and utilities on quite large communities. And a lot of what you talk about is trying to get to existing customers. I'm working on communities from anywhere from 10,000 to 150,000 new people. And there's virtually no discussion about building anything different than what we've built for 30 years. Is there any thought about how we can, what I believe is low-hanging fruit, and get to new communities and build them properly? And we're not seeing any engagement from any level of government to build a different distribution grid than I've built for 36 years now.
I would love to see this part of like the energy electrification and energy transition panel recommendations, to be honest, like, because you're right, like there needs to be like codes and standards, and, you know, I don't know whether it's like, you know, incentives are necessary, like the right incentives are there, but like, are they accessible? But I agree with you.
It's not incentives, it's mechanisms.
Yeah.
Like the biggest project we've got is the redevelopment of Downsview. We're building the city of Barrie in North York. And there is one different thing we're doing there that we haven't done in every other part of our development world ever. And we're putting 150,000 people in North York with no change.
So
I don't know how we get that.
How do we change it?
The LBC is the gatekeeper. I don't know how. There's no ability for the private sector to get involved and bring money to the table to create a different solution, because the LBC is the gatekeeper.
Yeah,
Downsview is owned by the federal government, by the way. They have billions of dollars in pension money. They would be happy to invest in a DER.
Yeah, I think the conversation, like, I think that's a very, very valid point. It's definitely an overlooked area from utilities, not just in Ontario, but across the country and all of North America. That said, I do sense a change in narrative happening right now. Utilities are feeling pain points around, you know, interconnecting new loads and keeping up with demand for electrification of heating and vehicles and all that stuff. And I think it is driving a conversation around, well, what do we do about the greenfield stuff now? You know, do we need to raise service standards from 100 amps to 200 amps? Do we need to, you know, make or mandate certain things as a must-have. My team does a lot of work on EV-ready building requirements for new developments. Some of that things that are really becoming about building new better and not having to just build with the current standards and then fix the problem later are starting to emerge. But I completely echo your comment. The conversation is extremely slow, and I don't know how to like what the key lever is to accelerate it. But I think we're going to start seeing it kind of organically accelerate when utilities start to really feel the pinch and the pain points of like the current system. We have utility clients that are getting bad rep because they can't interconnect customers on certain parts of the grid, and because just the grid was not planned to handle massive electrification of vehicles or fleets or whatnot. So I think some of those pinch points will organically get the conversation there, but I'm sure there's other levers that can also be pushed, but I unfortunately don't have any of them right now off the top of my head.
This is a very interesting question about just building the same over when you've got a greenfield situation where you would want to be embedding the capacity to do these things. It seems a place where you've got a sort of municipal LDC and provincial intersection that needs to happen in order for it to happen, and it just isn't. I mean, community energy planning is sort of a potential vehicle that tries to bring those actors together. But we've not been very effective at realizing it in terms of, because it'll have to be, I think, in the form of building code and other standards in terms of what needs to be built, so that it's either enabled or the infrastructures are there to enable these kinds of activities down the road. I've got a question in the chat, which I've managed to pull out. It's an interesting one. Thank you, Nick. That was a very, very important and very useful question. This one actually is about cybersecurity, and just asking, are there how to manage cybersecurity risks with increased penetration of DERs? Do we anticipate risks in that space, and how should we manage them?
Yeah, I know that the ISO is the coordinator for cybersecurity here too, but it is an emerging challenge. We're more interconnected, and I recall, must have been a few years. It's a few years ago now, so it's a bit dated. But there's a study in California that was looking at cybersecurity risk for hot water, the smart hot water heaters that they had, and if someone was able to connect into those and they controlled the operations of the hot water heaters, they could take down the grid, basically cause outage. It was very problematic, and I think it was just one of the first studies that I had seen at the time that showed that there was a real risk for cybersecurity for these sort of smart devices. I'm not an expert in this area. I think it was Patrick that recommended the question, but I know that it's an area of high priority for the ISO as the cybersecurity coordinator there. But it's something to kind of keep on top of. And definitely, I think it's not just DERs, it's all connected devices, I think is a problematic there. So
very good comment. We haven't not seeing anybody else, so I'll give Terry a second question here. If you want to go ahead, Terry.
Sure, thank you. Maybe put the three of you on the spot, including you, Mark. If there could one thing be done to accelerate the pace of this, what do you think that would be?
One thing. Our recommendations, procurement. Let's go. Honestly, I think we have to just not wait for the perfect scenario for things to go forward and just kind of start doing it, right? So a lot of the plans that I find in Ontario is okay, here are our plans, and it's kind of, we need to wait for this and this and this to kind of happen. But I think that, kind of giving the LDCs the right tools and incentives to run with programs, just start doing it, just pilot. There's so much need right now in Ontario coming up. If we're waiting for the perfect program or perfect solution, we're just going to be waiting a long time. So I think it's just a matter of kind of we know what we need to do, and it's just like, let's engage the LDCs, let's engage, ISO kind of move forward. They don't necessarily have to do it all, and just start move forward with some of these recommendations.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of that one. I think the if I had to pick one thing, it would be like just having a coordinated DER approach, province-wide approach. Like right now, there's a hodgepodge of incentives from markets, from rates, from LDC programming, and we all just need to get in a room and figure out who's doing what and how does it all fall under one comprehensive strategy. And the sooner we do that, the better. So again, I believe the programs are what Sarah's point, one of the key enablers here. But we can't just do programs without coordinating. Well, what are the programs going to do relative to the ISO procurements, relative to the rates OEB's issuing, relative, like there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, which is fine. We just need to like coordinate on who's doing what.
Yeah, I would, my 2 cents worth is mostly the same as Ahmed and Sarah's. But I think sorting out the role of the LDCs, especially in this, because as I mentioned before, some of them are pushing the envelope as it is, and are feeling sort of held back at the provincial level. So we really need to sort out they're the platform on which this all has to happen to a great degree. So we need to sort out their role and the incentives, as we've heard, around their activities, but also mandates as well to be engaged in this space would be something I would emphasize very strongly. I mean, the connection back to municipalities and community energy and climate planning, I think, is also very, very important, because that's the governance framework at the local level to try and bring these elements, to bring municipalities and the LDC and other actors into the conversation together to sort out how do you actually do this? How do you make it work?
Yeah, I just kind of riffing off what you just said too, Mark, there. Ontario invested a lot of time in CDM, like a lot of time and resources into developing all the infrastructure that went into developing and delivering CDM programs. It's like, we got to use that. we've had that for a long time. So yeah, it's a little bit frustrating because we know what we need to do, and I think it's just a matter of like really engaging in that and moving forward.
Yeah, I think we know where some of the centers of innovation around this are, and I say some of them are trying to push the envelope as it is. It's a question of almost getting out of the way to some degree and allowing some space to work within. We seem to have exhausted our supply of questions. I've got one I'm going to throw out at the end, and then we're probably a wrap unless there's any further. One question that was asking, occurred to me is just, I mean, methodologically, this looked a lot like an efficiency potential study. I mean, that's seemed sort of what you did. And one thing that I've wondered about in terms of how you define DERs is how much, from a system planning perspective, almost like how much overlap is there between what you've identified as a DER and I know we're behind on efficiency potential studies, but what have often been identified in those kinds of studies for Ontario, and are we potentially double counting, or how do we approach that question?
It's a great question. So from my perspective, there's zero overlap. So this study was exclusively scoped to exclude efficiency, which is covered in the CDM potential study that the ISO launches every 2 to 3 years. So what we're looking at here is in distributed generation, behind the meter, in front of the meter storage and generation, demand response, EV smart charging, the emerging areas that are not typically considered efficiency. It's the stuff that you can throttle up and down to some degree, you can actually have control over, and can, with the exception of solar and distributed generation, you can hold the button on to some extent. So yeah, the way I see this potential is it's completely additive to whatever potential is identified in the efficiency potential study. The one thing I'll just say is, when we do these studies in the US, our team has been doing the potential studies for the ERs for Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, for several years now, and we actually do everything, including efficiency. The one thing we do that we haven't done in this study is that we look at the interactive effects between efficiency and demand response, because there is interactive effects. Efficiency does impact what's available for grabs from the brand response perspective, and vice versa. So that's the one loop that this study did not close, because of the bifurcated nature of efficiency study and the DER study. But from a potential perspective, they're purely additive.
Sarah, anything to add on that?
No,
that's
more the experts. So on
yeah.
the
No, it's very good because in fact, yes, then the efficiency potential and the DER potential can be treated effectively as cumulative. It's subject to, is at the margin, as I'm saying, some overlap and some interaction, but can be treated as somewhat cumulative in terms of potential contributions, both on the energy and capacity sides from these kinds of resources.
Yeah,
what that sounds like.
Yeah, and just to maybe add a caveat to my comments. So I guess we technically did integrate the efficiency results because we relied on the APO, the ISO's annual planning outlook, which does, I believe, factor in some of the CDM scenarios that they believe will materialize. So to the extent that they were factored into the APO, we did factor in the efficiency, synergies and or interactive effects that would impact DR potential in the province.
Thank you. Any further questions before we make it a wrap? Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for their participation, and thank Sarah and Ahmed for their contributions, which have been absolutely fascinating and very, very useful contributions to the conversation that's now unfolding in Ontario. I'd say this session is the first in a series we're planning on running over the next few months on options for Ontario. And I'll mention now that the next scheduled one is for Wednesday, March 29th at 12:30. And that is looking at the net zero electricity options for Ontario study that was done for the Atmospheric Fund by Power Advisory again. And that we will be putting announcements for that one on the wires on Monday in terms of registration information. And then we are also planning on doing a couple of other sessions like this one, looking at the work that Dunsky did on renewables costs for Ontario and Alberta. And then also we will, we're just trying to pin down a date for the folks at UVic who did a very, very detailed study for the David Suzuki Foundation looking at net zero scenarios for the electricity system nationally. So this is an interesting moment we find ourselves in, that the conversation is being enriched in all kinds of interesting ways, that we're sort of seeing contributions from modeling and analysis like we haven't seen for some time in terms of potential future pathways for electricity systems, and we're kind of hoping we can help to inform the conversation by facilitating these discussions. So I'd like to close again by thanking Ahmed and Sarah for their contributions and for everybody else's participation as well. As I say, we will be putting things on the wires in terms of the next session on the 29th, and then the dates and the details on the future sessions as well. So with that, I'm going to end the meeting. We have recorded it, so we will also be putting it up on the Sustainable Energy Initiative website. So if there are things people want to sort of hear in more detail, they can do that. And I'm sure also Ahmed and Sarah will be happy to hear from people directly if they've got specific questions. So again, thank you all very much, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And
Thank
thanks, everyone.
you.